windows and yell racial slurs at them, the N-word, and swear at them and so on. I was like, really? This is Apple in Wisconsin? I was hard to believe. More recently, I'm the co-chair of Common Ground, and we are working on what we're calling a, quote, big idea. We're sharing that with a number of people, including Stronger Together, Fox Valley, Celebrate Diversity at Fox Cities. I've got a conversation with Pastor Charles Butler, who happens to be Black, this Friday. And we're trying to figure out if there's a role that Common Ground can play in helping address this issue within the Fox cities. So we just got the book today from Amazon, so I've not read the first chapter, but I'm fascinated to learn more so that we can maybe make a difference locally.
Next, someone?
I could just quick, I am a baby boomer, 1960s. I'll be turning 60 next month. I grew up in Waukesha, suburb outside of Milwaukee, and my uncle was a beat cop in Milwaukee during the race riots back in the day. And my dad was a police officer in Waukesha for many years. So got the blue side of it very much. And Mom's not here, but I don't think she would deny the fact that they were both very racist and vocal about it when I was growing up. So when I went off to college, I was probably the first time that I really was in a diverse, and I went up to the University of Minneapolis of all places. So very diverse culture, and learned a lot. And when I started dating a Black man, I was disowned. And neither here nor there, the relationship didn't last, but it wasn't because of his skin color, but you learn that there's nice people and bad people in all walks of life. So that's what that is. So yeah, the book, I'm finding very much that I can relate to her principles is how I was raised, and a lot of the cultural thinking the same. So it'll be interesting to hear how everybody's take on it. I just have a hard time thinking that it is we've come a long, long way, I think, as a society. So I struggle with both sides of it, the blue side and the Black side.
Thanks.
I am not sure exactly what Leah said, but I was born in 1943 and grew up in Manitowoc. And I can remember the first and only Black person or family coming to Manitowoc. So then I went to college at Stout, and it's been a lot of years, but I imagine there were some Blacks there. Probably most of them were from other countries that I can remember. And then my first year teaching in Waukegan, I had Blacks in class, and that was a very new experience to me. And since moving to Menasha and teaching, I can't remember having a lot of Blacks in class. Obviously, I had some, but so my experience is quite limited.
I'm Michelle. I'm the Gen Xer of the group, I guess. And I grew up in Green Bay, went to college at Marquette in Milwaukee, and I have one Black friend. And I know that I have inadvertently said stuff to just piss her off. So I know I've screwed up, and thankfully she's still my friend, but I'm looking to learn. And it is one of those conundrums where you're just, the justified anger on their side, and you're afraid to ask some of the questions. And there's privilege that we have no idea. I think it was chapter that she wrote about the GI Bill. And it blew my mind. So yeah, I'm just here to learn.
Thanks. Linda, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I guess I'm Linda Palmbach, and I'm a nurse in public health. And the book was recommended to me a while ago, and I picked it up and read a few chapters, and I'm not a very good reader. So I'm hoping to finish the book because it is very good. The chapters that I did read, I lose time or whatever. I have a lot to learn, and I was born in Ohio, Southern Ohio, and Dad moved us up here in 1974. My experience with Black people was very limited in Ohio, but it was even more so limited here. There was like literally no Black people in my classes or anything like that. But my work has definitely put me in touch with a multitude of persons of color all around different countries, and just, you know, our own Blacks here. But I definitely have a lot to learn, and I can see some of the things that she says in the book. I can't believe that stuff actually happened, but it did. So it's just, it's an eye opener. It's just truly an eye opener. And I'm hoping to learn a lot from this study.
Thank you. So we'll move into just the first chapter, where called What Wasn't Said. And talks about whatever happened to the Indians is where she starts, and that whole story. And it talks about, she heard a version of the story. It wasn't the whole story, it was a version. And talking about stereotypes are incomplete. She talks about racializing, passing along belief, the belief that race, skin color were connected to inherent human differences. And that this was portrayed as whites being superior. So that's just kind of a brief little overview. And then the question in the back for us to talk about, what stereotypes about people of another race do you remember hearing and believing as a child? Were you ever encouraged to question stereotypes?
I have just a quick answer to that. I remember singing "Jesus Loves the Little Children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in His sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world." So that was certainly the attitude, but there wasn't really connection with people of color. But one of the things that was kind of a wake-up call, and she speaks to it at the end of this chapter. I was listening to a man who does trainings on diversity. And so he came into this large room and he asked people, how many of you believe in diversity? And all the hands went up, and he said, diverse from what? Diverse from what? Like, whiteness is the core, and whatever's not whiteness is diverse from whiteness. That just really sort of, diverse from what?
Mhm. Yeah. Pat, are you?
I remember when I was a kid, we have an aunt and uncle that lives in Antigo, Wisconsin. And whenever we would drive from Denmark to Antigo, it was always the question, were we going to go through the Indian reservation or go around it? And it was just, always so interesting that I always wondered, why did they have their own little special place like that when we were traveling through? And then years later, of course, was where she talks about, can relate to always hearing about how they all had an alcoholism problem and how we put that upon them and stuff. But I always wondered, why did they have their own special spot? And that as a kid, I didn't think that was a bad thing, but now I know better. So.
Mhm.
Yeah, and why were they so lucky that they got to have the casinos? Like, why did they get to have the casinos and we don't?
Nancy, did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to add on to that because that was real interesting reading about the Indians because my first teaching job was in Shawano.
Yeah.
And that was in the 1974. And I was there a couple of years. And during that time is when the Indians took over the novitiate. And some of you probably never heard of that, but so that was a beautiful building, I guess, somewhere out there in the woods. And they took over. And to this day, I really don't even know why they took over. But I had some Indians in my classes. I taught math classes. And there's a couple of stories that I remember about teaching. And that was at lunchtime. The Indians would go outside in front of the building and the boys would get in a ring. And then they would get out their knives and they would be throwing them at the person in the center of the ring. And it was just the strangest thing, you know, that was even going on in that town. And it's just like, my friend also speaks about, you know, when he grew up in the country and he went to school on the bus and the kids would take their shotguns with them on the bus because afterwards they were going to go hunting, you know, and that's how different it was back then. The other thing was I had, we were on a modular scheduling and I was coming into my classroom that I had. So you moved from classroom to classroom, the teachers did. And I was coming in and all of a sudden there were two kids jumping out of the window. and nobody was supposed to be in that room. So that was another weird thing. But I could tell there was some drugs being smoked in there. So when the novitiate was taken over, I had been working a dance, the school dance that night. And there was always a policeman at the dance. And all of a sudden, you know, I must have been standing near him and he said, well, they just blew up the newspaper office. Well, I lived right on Main Street on a corner and that was just like a block away from me. So, you know, I had all those experiences. And then I just wanted to add, I really didn't know anything about Indian schools and how they took the Indians from where they grew up and our government took them and put them in an Indian school. And it was miles away from where they lived. It could have even been in another state. But when I was in Phoenix at the Heard Museum, they have a whole display set, I think it's a permanent one, and it's all on the Indian schools. And that's the first time I ever remember hearing about the Indian schools and what all went on there. So that was very interesting. I guess that's all I have on that part.
There's a great book, and it was made into a really great movie called The Education of Little Tree. If you ever get a chance, it's beautifully written, and the movie is true to the book, and it speaks to that experience.
What's the name of the book again? Could you repeat that?
The Education of Little Tree.
Thank you.
One of the things I was going to say, I thought that chapter really stimulated for me some thinking. Growing up in the 50s and growing up in Madison, we didn't have a whole lot of interaction with Native American Indians in that area, except for the Dells. So Wisconsin Dells really colored our vision of what Indians were like, because you'd go there to visit. There weren't any water parks then. It was pretty much, you know, you'd buy your little Indian doll and, you know, that's what you had. But you know, I really started to think about how my childhood growing up in school or wherever, really what we learned was that Indians, Native Americans were very savage people. That's what we studied in history. That's what we learned. We also learned it through TV, which TV came on the forefront in the late 50s. And for those of you as old as me, you know that the most popular shows were cowboy shows, right? And so it was cowboy and Indians, and it was white against Indians, and the Indians were bad people and the whites were the good people. So we really, I think we grew up in an era which really colored our thinking, even before, like Michelle, before casinos or anything came on board. I really think we may have never even crossed paths with a Native American, but that was what our thinking was we got it from TV and from history lessons that were taught in school, unfortunately, which didn't give a very accurate picture back then, I don't believe.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I would say what I learned about, I didn't grow up with any people of any color. And so what I learned about them was from TV. And it wasn't talked about in my house either. I mean, we didn't have conversations about race or different people. And I guess I just didn't ask any questions. I was raised in a white environment and never really thought much about it, I guess, until I got, older. And I think like a lot of you who I left that white environment and went to something else where it was, they were people of different color there. So yeah, I grew up with a lot of assumptions that I didn't even know were assumptions because I just assumed that's the way it was for everybody because I didn't know really other people lived differently and had different cultures where, they went to school with a gun and then they were going to go hunting. That was just part of the culture, I would assume, but yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Any more in that first chapter? The second chapter is called Family Values. And that's very interesting, talking about how her family values shaped what she thought and felt, what she thought was right. For example, staying busy is good character. Complaining is out of the question. Showing emotions is weak. Having a good attitude is a must. And judging others if they didn't fit into your cultural norms, that something was wrong with them. So the question she asked to reflect on your family values. And did you do that? And did you find some principles or values or unspoken beliefs that shapes you and what you think of others?
She pretty much echoed almost everything that I was brought up thinking. And my family is Germanic in background and heritage, and hard work is how we were raised, and authoritarian with the do as I say, not as I do, but don't question authority. So just even thinking to question what you saw and heard just wasn't even an option. I mean, you never even thought to do that. And like I say, my world was, my eyes were opened when I went to college. Waukesha was a very Hispanic place, and that was very racist that way. But you didn't even think of it as racism. I mean, the word racism wasn't even there. It was more us versus them, but I didn't know that was what racism was at the time, really.
Mhm.
There was definite cultural divides is what I thought of it as, but not territorial divides, I guess. Very interesting. But yep, same value.
Karen, did you?
Growing up, my parents definitely, I'd come home from school and I'd say I've met a new friend or something, and I would say their name and, oh, are they German? I don't know. She's just in my class. Oh, is she Italian? It didn't make any difference to me, but for them, they had been brought up so much, knowing, wanting to know everyone else's nationality, so racism worked its way in there. My dad worked in Chicago, so he dealt with some of the Blacks in Chicago, and he had the opinion that they were lazy, the ones he had dealt with, so that's what I just assumed. And, so they had opinions on those things and shared them. And I always thought, it seemed kind of narrowing of things, but other than that, I didn't question it with my parents. I just went along with it and didn't care whether they were German or Italian or whatever.
I liked that where she says, the household atmosphere of endless possibility surely ingrained in me the belief that if I could envision it, it could be done. That was certainly true in my family, that if you want to do something, you can do it. And you have to work really hard. But if you want something, you can, if you want to do something, you can do it. And as a consequence of that, there was kind of a side note that you have to help people. Because you can do what you want to do, it's the expectation that you will help people.
Pat?
I think the other thing I remember from growing up, because like I said, except for that year, summer at Bible camp, when Dr. Trout was there, was I think of racism as also being part of classism, because I can remember we used to always have like the Polish jokes and that, and you know, so you're talking, Karen, about the, you know, what ethnicity are you? I don't even think other colors, other than driving through the reservation and, you know, noting that we were going through the Indian reservation, but was even on my line of vision. But certainly different people of different cultures and countries was part of that. So.
Dean, did you want to share something? I saw your.
Yeah, my background is, when I look back now, it's sort of mind-boggling, but I grew up in a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota. My dad grew up in the Midway district, which, for a frame of reference, the house I lived in for a year was one block from where the St. Paul fires were the first night of George Floyd. It's about 3 miles where George Floyd was murdered. But when I grew up, what I learned was that everybody was proud of their heritage. So my dad would say, well, the Irish people live in Frogtown. The Italians live on the east side of St. Paul, and they're incredibly good hockey players. Lou Contronio, an Italian, coaches them. And the Jewish people live in Highland Park. And we told Polak jokes. And then the scandal of all scandals, 100 years ago, my grandfather on my mom's side was 100% Swedish. He married a Norwegian. So it was always this conflict about nationalities, and Black people lived in Selby Dale. So I just learned that nationalities congregated by themselves, and everybody was proud of themselves, but it was a real confusing, like, what's the big deal about Italians versus Irish versus this and that? And yeah, so it was, you know, I guess I didn't grow up with as much of a bias about Black people as a question about why is everybody so into themselves?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, our history was, everyone came from, well, my parents are from Door County. It's the largest Belgian settlement in the country. Everybody was Belgian. If we wanted to really degrade somebody, we told a Polak joke. And nationalities was everything, but I never considered like racism was a thing. I don't think I even recognized it until I was a freshman in college, and I had a Filipino friend, and he was like, yeah, you know, around here, you guys are really racist. And I was like, you are so full of it. Quit, get off your pity party. And I remember we had an argument about it, and of course I was wrong. But yeah, for me, it wasn't and again, Green Bay is white. At the time I grew up, Green Bay was white. And I didn't know racism was a thing. I mean, I thought it was like folklore. It was more nationalities, and it was European nationalities. And furthermore, the people that I grew up around came right from Europe to Wisconsin. And I don't think they, you know, I hope they had nothing to do with owning slaves or being above people of color. I don't really know. So anyway.
Nancy, Megan, did you want to say?
Yeah. Dean, you were talking about the different nationalities, and in Oshkosh, as I was talking to my sister about some of these, she says she remembers her mother-in-law So this would be the generation before me, which would be what? The greatest generation, maybe. Anyway, she said that when her mother-in-law, there were more fights between the Irish, the German, and the Russians. And so it was, when I heard her say that, it kind of reminded me of that movie, The Gangs of New York. I don't know if you've seen that, but you've got the Irish fighting against the, what was it, the Italians? I don't even remember. But so that all seemed to be a generation before me even, where that was all going on, because I didn't see any of that, you know, when I was growing up. So that's how things had kind of changed from one generation to another even.
One thing I recognized when I wrote down those principles is that, you know, my family was waste not, want not. And if you didn't have something, you must be wasteful. And I think that translates to, you know, people in poverty must be wasteful. And, you know, those are the sorts of unconscious things that you hold on to unless you write them down and look at them. And, you know, now I know that's not necessarily true, but it's one of those things that you hold in your head, and it's supposed to keep you, you know, it's supposed to keep you busy and, you know, earning and not being wasteful. But it's also one of those things that you can use to judge other people with. So I thought it was a good exercise just to write down all of those things that, you know, that I didn't realize that messages I got in my family system. Any other comments on that chapter? So the next one was about race versus class. And she talks about how both of those are real and both of them matter. And they're linked through socioeconomic, and that skin color affects both race and economics. And we have social value and belonging and access to wealth. And that social value helps the dominant culture and gets them access to wealth. And she talks about all of that. And then at the end of the chapter, she talks about class is determined by income, wealth, education, and profession. And then she lists those different categories. How would you characterize your parents' class? Were they poverty, working class, lower middle class, professional middle class, upper middle class, and owning class is what she put there. Your parents, your grandparents, you as a child, you now, and what message did you get about race in each of those classes? Pat?
Well, my parents were definitely, my dad was definitely working class. He was in the factory. My mom was a teacher and certainly I probably am the professional middle class, having gone to school and getting a master's degree in that. So, but I'm the only one in my family that actually went to college and, you know, went that particular direction, even though in my whole family, we have a lot of teachers. So that messages, I don't really know. I mean, my mom was always real encouraging about everything. My dad wanted me to make sure I got into a good profession that would, you know, be stable until I got married, which I never did. So, you know, that's my family.
I think I already said that came from a working class. My parents, unfortunately, because they lost their parents early in their childhood, neither of them went to school beyond 8th grade. So they definitely were challenged. So hardworking was the big thing because they ended up making a wonderful life for a family of 4 kids. And it was through hard work. It wasn't through an education. We didn't have much, but it didn't matter because we had faith and we had each other. So I feel very fortunate because, like you, Pat, even though one of my brothers went to college, none of my cousins and certainly none of the female relatives ever went beyond high school. So I was kind of a rarity in my mom's family and in my dad's family. And I was seen that way too. So, but what I want to relate to is this was really hard for me, the race versus class, because of what my background, but because I went to get ready, Lori. I went to Waukesha. I went to Carroll College for 2 years. And when you go to Carroll College, at least in 1968, you either were on a scholarship or you came from an extremely wealthy family who could afford Carroll. So talk about class division, it was huge. It is one of the reasons why I didn't stay at Carroll College past 2 years. I found it very difficult. I felt discriminated against because I was of a working class. I'll never forget a shopping trip I made with a very wonderful female friend, but she came from an extremely wealthy family from Chicago. And she literally took me to Brookfield Square to hold her items while she purchased them for a cruise. So I have some, so, you know, those are some things, but the one interesting thing too is a lot of us who are on scholarship hung out together then because we felt more comfortable. Well, one of the young men who went to Carroll was there on a basketball scholarship, and he was the first Black person I ever became friends with. And he came from the inner city of Chicago, and he was recruited by Carroll College to play basketball, right? But his best buddy on the basketball team and I dated for a little bit, so we all became friends. Well, I thought I would somewhat challenge my parents and their beliefs and challenge myself, because Bob said to me, that was his name, there were a group of us going to go to Madison to have some fun, right? And there were about 6 of us. And I said, oh, my parents, we got a basement, everybody can sleep there. And Bob looked me in the eye and he said, I won't be able to, will I? And I said, sure, knowing full well I had no clue what my parents would do. I really, the whole way there, I was like so scared. Well, we did some, I don't even remember what we did. We all got together, and that night, and you know, everybody camped out in the basement. We had a finished basement. And in the morning, I'll never forget, I was in my bedroom with 2 of the women upstairs, and the guys were downstairs. And we got up, and there was Bob sitting on the couch with this huge afro in 1968 with a big comb sticking out of it. And my dad comes in and goes, hello? And I would say my dad would be in the racist column. So we lived through it, but that's where I had a real hard time during those 2 years there. Was it race? Was it class? Who was, you know, what was going on? And so I still, that still shapes who I am.
Karen?
I think that's interesting, Nancy. I had never thought about it that way. Now, like at Luther, I mean, my parents had the money, so, you know, they paid to send me to Luther. And I knew quite a few people that were there on scholarships, but I never saw that there was a difference in that way. You know, I don't, you know, and now that we've gone back to our 50th class reunion, one of the guys who lives here in Appleton that was back for the class reunion with us, he had said, oh, those 2 gals from New York who had a crush on him our freshman year. And he knows about it and everything, and his wife knows about it. And he always thought, well, I never would have asked them out, because he assumed because they were from New York that they were rich. But as far as my upbringing, both of my parents came from, my mother's parents came over from Czechoslovakia, and my dad's parents and my dad came from Sweden. And Dad was on a farm and my mother was on a farm, and they got into, my grandfather and her brothers got into strip mining in Pennsylvania. And so they were definitely did not have money to spare. But both of my parents, my mother was one of 12. She was the only one that went to college. And my dad went to college. He would have graduated, you know, he would have been like 110 right now. No, 100, almost 120. And my mother's 100 now. And anyway, but they both had, Dad was an electrical engineer, my mother was a teacher and then became a principal. And so I was brought up with you know, we didn't worry about money. We were definitely penny pinchers. We used to tease my parents, do they have the $1 million buried in the backyard? But anyway, and then I met Al, who had no money. And I'm sure my parents were scared about, you know, what we would do. And I think back to us, you know, at 20 years old, you know, deciding to get married. And was I sure he would ever hold down a job, or, you know, but he was connected with his mother well. So, and I knew family was important to him. So that's all I have.
Thanks.
Not to beat a dead horse about the class versus race thing, but I was completely oblivious, and I went to Marquette, which is weird because it's a Jesuit university in the middle of downtown Milwaukee. And there were people of color there, but they weren't students. And I remember one time talking to some friends of mine in the cafeteria, and one of them was from Little Chute, and she's like, well, Little Chute is more diverse than Marquette. And I'm thinking, no, it's not, because there's people of color down here. She's like, yeah, there's men, women, and children. And I was like, you know what? What she said was kind of ironically true, because there weren't really people of color at Marquette. It was a white upper middle class university. And, you know, you went there if you could. I mean, there were scholarship kids, but, you know, not too many. Small population kids. So anyway.
So I've got something to add. So I went to St. Olaf College, academic scholarship and loans, but my family was, nobody in my family or all my cousins had ever gone to college or graduated from college. I was like number 14 out of 20 cousins. So I was sort of a weirdo for going to college. But my brother followed me a year later, and he had one of his best friends was a guy named Cornelius Powell. So if you can imagine Cornelius, he was a black guy from Virginia. And for Thanksgiving that year, Cornelius couldn't go all the way back to Virginia. So my brother had him home at our house. And I told you earlier about how I thought my parents were real prejudiced. My dad had all this stuff. It went amazingly well. My dad, he shocked me. He was so welcoming to Corny, because we always call him Corny or CO. And then eventually, a year or two later, he started to date this woman who was red-haired and amazingly fair-skinned white woman, and they got married. And, you know, we continued to exchange Christmas cards with CO and Mary for the next 45 years until he died of a cancer or something. So I guess when I look back, I'm surprised now to reflect on how welcoming my parents were, considering how they labeled everybody as a certain nationality. I don't know what got into them that Thanksgiving, but it was really special.
One story from high school of it was socio class and color. My best friend in high school was Filipino. She was the child of a doctor, and we were, but definitely from different classes. She was the doctor's daughter, and my dad was retired, and we lived in Tomahawk, and we didn't even own the house. He rented it, and we were great friends. But I wondered, a few years into the relationship, I didn't really question it, and I thought, why doesn't she have any? She's lived there from a child on. And when I met her, she did not have any close friends. She was not, I wasn't breaking up any relationship she had with another girlfriend. It dawned on me that she really was not accepted into that all white community. And, you know, if she'd been white and doctor's daughter, I probably would have not been friends with her or accepted into the group, because I got to know some of the girls, and I was in sports, and I couldn't get into their clique either. But it was, you know, I didn't really think about it until much later in the relationship. and some of the incidents with her as well in high school, and sort of understanding, you know, at the time I thought it was just high school stuff, but later looking back, race was involved for sure in what was happening. So
the story that was like a punch in the gut to me in this chapter was the African-American man who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And then at the celebration, a woman gave him her ticket and asked him to get her coat.
yeah. Any other comments on that chapter? We're going to
I
move
was
in.
going to say, and it was on the same page as the story that Cindy was just talking about, where she talked about the white man who shared with her how he shoplifted his way through college. And she said, and the one time he was caught, he was just warned and allowed to go. And she said, if that had been a young man of color, he probably would have been taken to court and possibly put in jail or whatever. But what that reminded me of is the difference in the way young men of color are treated if they are stopped for practically anything. And I think about this young man that Rayshard, I think was his name, Rayshard Brooks or Brooke, the young black man who fell asleep in his car in the Wendy's line. And the white police officers asked him to pull over, and they held him for 40 minutes, and then eventually he was shot and killed. And I wonder if that would have ended any differently if he had been a young white man who had had too much to drink, fell asleep in his car. Maybe they would have just asked him to pull over and let us give you a ride home. And I think it really points up the difference in the treatment.
And that's the white privilege. That's the white privilege right there, because it's not just the black men, it's black women also that get followed. And if they are driving a nice car and going into a nice area, they get followed and they get pulled over, the same thing. So it's not just men, it's women also. I just wanted to add one other thing. When we looked at the classes like of our grandparents and our parents and ourselves, the one thing that stood out to me was how we've kind of moved up the ladder as the generations have progressed. Part of that is, I'm sure, because of education. And that's another privilege. And I think the Black population doesn't have that opportunity because of a lack of a good education. So that was one thing that really came out as I looked at that was they can't move up. Generation after generation might not be able to move up because of the situation where they're at such a poverty level, and the school system is not a good system, and it's not training them. And if they're not trained, how can they move on? So I think that brought out to me a basic need of where we're lacking in education. That's all I have.
Other comments? The next little chapter was on optimism. That was something she soaked up and was part of the social forces that she lived in. And she talks about that and having a worry-free life and all of that. So the question at the end of that chapter is about what were some of the major economic, political, demographic, and pop culture trends from 10 years before your birth until 20? How do they show up in your life? How do you think they influenced your beliefs? Pat?
Okay, so I found it interesting in this chapter. It just kind of hit me, and that, and not to with when they talked about the GI Bill
Mhm.
and how all these guys got the GI Bill, and I thought how different that they probably thought of those guys as compared to what we talk about entitlement in today's society, and where there's all this big debate about how people take advantage of entitlements and all of this, and they shouldn't have entitlements. And yet I don't think there'd probably be one legislator in that day and age back when they were giving out the money for that. And I'm glad they did. I don't think they shouldn't have. But when they had those GI Bills, nobody said, well, do they really deserve? Should we really be giving these people this entitlement? So that was the thing that hit me most in that chapter.
Well, I learned a lot about cultural stuff from TV, from the Donahue show. I don't know if any of you remember that, but I watched it as a kid, and I learned a lot about all of what was going on in society. Like I said, we didn't talk about the world or what was happening in society at home very much, and not really at school either. Thank you, Cindy. So I'm glad that TV was talking about that, and people were having Black people of color, feminism. I mean, all of that was being talked about, and people were coming on TV and talking about it, that I could learn about it. I don't think I learned much in school really about any of those things. Our history class was all from white, really male perspective. We learned about Betsy Ross. I think that was the only white female I ever heard about. I surely didn't hear about most anybody else. And so, I learned a lot from on the television, and reading books and movies, and trying to find out from those sources. And I think that's a lot shaped me, to try to understand the culture context I came from, but how I want to be. I think feminism surely shaped my life, and along with my faith. I think that together, saying that you're valuable as not only a child of God, but as a woman, and that your image is important to God, and all of that, I think led me to pursue being a pastor, which is a male-dominated field. And I think that all of that, the society helped that. Those women and men and people of color who were pushing, civil rights and human rights and female rights, all of that movement of society affected me, even though I really probably at the time didn't understand it or know what was happening. But now I see it when you look back, and you can see how that shaped who you became. So I thought that was an interesting reflection to go through and look at society.
There was a lot going on in the 60s as far as I was concerned. Like you said, feminism. There were the assassinations of key leaders in the United States. And of course, being a resident of Madison, I grew up in a time when there was total unrest. The Sterling Hall bombing happened. I felt it at my house. There were the protests. Vietnam War was going on. Two of my older brothers both served in Vietnam. The one came back to become a police officer, and he and I would have discussions about the fact that he was on the front line stopping the riots, and where was I going to be? So it made for some interesting family discussions. So when I look back at that, there was so much was happening so fast, I believe, in the 60s and in that time when I was growing up until I was 20 at about in 1970, that kind of makes my head spin sometimes about, you know, just how that shapes you, because it does shape you. No matter what you say, it does shape you.
Anyone else want to talk about how they think culture maybe has shaped them?
I agree. I agree with what Nancy just said. You know, I grew up in that same time period, and that's when I was in middle school and high school. And I remember in high school, I was the president of the Future Teachers of America. And I remember saying to my advisors, and I think that was when maybe there was a lot of the riots and things, or the conflict between black and whites going on. And I said, maybe we could do an exchange to Milwaukee. And he just looked at me and he says, Nancy, I don't think that's a good idea right now. But I guess that's how that shaped me, is that, you know, I guess I felt like, is there anything that I can do to learn from this, or can I put myself in this position or whatever? And part of that in my life came from my faith and from Sunday school. And I remember in fourth grade, I had this male Sunday school teacher, and he would call me Little Sunshine all the time. And I guess at that point in Sunday school is when I kind of developed this philosophy of, you know, we need to love all people, just like somebody said before, black or white, you know, or whatever in his sight. And that was kind of what was in my heart. And so then when we had the Vietnam War, and then we had the peace and not war, all of those things going on in Washington, DC, and what was the other, the big music thing. What was it? Somebody help me here.
What is it
Woodstock. Yes, Woodstock.
Woodstock.
You know, and that was a big change. And I think that was then the time, like you said, with women's rights. That's when they were burning their bras, and you know, it was a whole new era. And so when I went on to college and decided to go into teaching, for some reason that really didn't seem like that was that out of the ordinary for me. You know, again, just everybody thinks like this, don't they? You know, but then it was interesting when I was actually teaching, and I don't know if it was it was later on, I had run into one of my former female students, and she came up to me and she said, you know, Miss Becker or whatever, she said, I just want you to know it's all because of you that I decided to go into teaching, because I thought if you could do it, I could certainly do it. So at that time, there weren't women teaching math. That was a whole new thing. And she actually saw that. And so at that time, all the girls were saying, oh yeah, I just want to get married and have babies. That was it. And I also remember my uncle saying to me when I went to college, he said, we were together for a Christmas, and he was always the one that was like to start things up, you know. He said, oh, you'll never make it through, you'll drop out. And I thought, well, that was really encouraging. But that was his attitude about women, you know, going on and doing things better. That was not normal at that time. And I was the first in my family to go on to college, the only one also. Yeah, there was a lot of things happening at that time. That's all I have.
Lori, did you want to say something? I know you.
Pretty much what Nancy was just saying, and how Cindy had said the red and yellow, black and white was That's what I believed all the time. And it just really hurt me during the racial riots in Milwaukee. My dad had to get his uniform on to go get our grandma out. She lived down there. That's where they grew up. And he had to put his uniform on in order to go down and rescue her from the riots. And it just, the anger that you would see on TV. And I remember crying as a kid watching the police hurt the Black people when they were dragging them, and the Molotov cocktails being thrown and gas and all this. And it was the whole situation and explosiveness. And it just kind of came back to life watching all these riots. And it scares me, because it's like, there's the protesting part of it I get. It's the violence that it ensues and the mob mentality that it just freaks me out still to this day. So I want to be supportive, but at the same time, I'm like, holy cow, not again, it's scary. And then, seeing neighborhoods get ripped apart that had, my grandma we used to go down and double Dutch jump rope with the Black kids in the neighborhood. And at the time, I didn't know color from nothing. It was like we had more fun double Dutching with them than anything. And we couldn't go anymore. And it was like, well, they're my friends, and you just didn't understand until somebody told you, well, it's wrong. What do you mean it's wrong? Nobody could explain that. And I still don't get it. Don't like it.
Yeah. Pat, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Nancy, you would have liked it because the year after Dr. Trout was at our Bible camp, the next year it was a pastor. He was white, but he brought 2 African-American kids with him from Cleveland, Ohio. And that was like the first time for all of us white kids from the country that we experienced listening to him. And then right after that was when all the riots happened. And I just remember thinking, whoa, what a different world. I couldn't even imagine the world they lived in. So anyway, I'm just going to share that.
Yeah, wow. Other comments? Okay, the last chapter is Within the Walls, and she talks about the exclusive world that she lived in, being with people who were just like her, never talking about anything that would bring conflict, a life absent of social concerns. The question at the end of the chapter is, how connected to or disconnected from the larger world was your family, your school, your town? How much did you understand about conflict and struggle in your world or beyond? How did you make sense of the people who had material wealth and people who didn't? What was your family's attitude about people in power? I know we probably covered some of that already. Any other comments about that?
We had a much different understanding of our politicians in that day and age and a trust of them than we do now. For all the other question, we were so far off the beaten path from that, I don't think we even thought about it. So.
Interesting. The one phrase, don't air your dirty laundry. I mean, that was how we lived. Nope. Couldn't do it. And especially my dad being a police officer, you could not say, there was no discussion. It was not allowed. No discussions about this, that, or the other thing. It's like, just toe the line. That's where you did it.
Yeah. Well, it probably went along with a culture that trusted in authority as well. Most people did just go along with a lot what they were told. And then that started to fall apart, I think, as people realized that a lot of the authority was oppressive, really. They were listening to people who were saying, that's not really the authority we want to live under. That's not fair to us. So, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, there was never, like if I did question something or why he thought that way, it was just because that's the way it is. There wasn't really an answer. And that was so frustrating to me. It's like, but that, and if I challenged him, it just put a wedge between us. it got to the point where we could not at holidays talk about anything. You couldn't talk about religion, you couldn't talk about politics, you couldn't talk about Chrysler as a car. There was just things you weren't allowed to talk about. And it was just because that was the way it was. So, yeah.
Other comments about any of the rest of the, or anything else you want to comment before we end the session about the book, or thoughts about the chapters at all?
I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book. I like these first 5 things, and I do like how she writes, and she is very much like the experience that I remember growing up. So looking forward to the rest of the book.
Yeah, I think it will be good. So the next time we meet next Wednesday, we'll read the section midlife wake up call, pages 29 to 54.
Mm.
And so we'll talk about those chapters.
All right.
Okay. Any other thoughts before we close with a prayer? No? Okay. Let us pray.
Mm.
Gracious God, we thank you for this time to discuss and talk honestly about our feelings and thoughts as we try to grow in our self-awareness. Help us become aware of how we can treat Black people and people of color with more justice and more equity and more love. Help us to continue to grow in that commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you, and see you next week, next Wednesday. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
See you at church.
Bye, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. Lori, so now I just put leave and then that's the meeting's closed, or how does that, or?
Right now, because I did the sign in as the primary, I have to end it.
Okay, was I supposed to go to Zoom and sign in, or how was I?
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
practice it before next week. We'll do
Okay, let's practice it, 'cause
Yeah.
I need to do a hands-on. I'm like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, honestly, I think I had been on it earlier in the day with that whole Zoom ticket thing.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I'm going to stop this.